In 1974, Baddeley and Hitch replaced the concept of short-term store with working memory. The components of the system are thought to be limited in capacity and relatively independent. If two tasks use the same component, they can't be performed successfully together. If two tasks use different components, they should be able to perform similarly together. Selecting chess moves involves the central executive and the visuospatial sketchpad, but not the phonological loop. And it goes into those things soon. Evolving approaches to understanding memory, and there's two videos to watch. One is Alan Baddeley's Working Memory, Theories, Models and Controversies. So Alan Baddeley is spelled A-L-A-N and then B-A-D-D-E-L-E-Y. And the other one is Alan Baddeley's Separating Long-Term Memory and Short-Term Memory. The actual name of the video is Separating LTM, STM. I'll try and link them, but I couldn't get through the first one. It's completely boring. I would recommend looking up a different video. So the working memory of Baddeley and Wilson is made up of component parts and processes. The central executive, visuospatial sketchpad, phonological loop, which has two parts, the articulatory control and the phonological store, and the readings will explain these. It's a good idea to look up the working memory model to get an idea of how it works. So the phonological loops have two main components, the passive phonological store and the articulatory process. The passive phonological store is concerned with speech perception. Auditory presentation of words has direct access to the store, whereas visual presentation has indirect access to the phonological store through subvocal articulation. Studies have shown the phonological loop activates the left inferior parietal cortex. The articulatory process is linked to speech production and provides indirect access to the phonological store. Neuroimaging has shown activation in the left inferior frontal cortex. Phonological similarity effect. Larson, Baddeley and Andrade found that recall was 25% worse with a phonologically similar list when compared to a dissimilar list. This suggests that we use speech-based rehearsal processes within the phonological loop. This is so complex. Word length effect. Based on a number of studies, memory span is lower for words that take a long time to say. Baddeley and others found that articulatory suppression eliminated the word length effect. Word length effect persists even when output delay is controlled by using a recognition memory test. This suggests that the phonological loop capacity is determined by temporal duration. Phonological loop evaluated. There are accounts for phonological similarity and the word length effect. These are supported by neuroimaging studies. This may function to learn new words. Articulatory suppression disrupts foreign native word pairings but not native pairings. It reduces the phonological loop, which is necessary to hold the sounds of non-native words in this task. And loop's capacity predicts vocabulary size, which is important developmentally. There's another video where he explains the phonological loop, which is Alan Baddeley, Introduction of the Phonological Loop. I've been waiting for the rain to stop, but it is relentless, so I'm just going to talk over the top of it and hopefully be heard. Okay, Baddeley added this fourth component to the working memory model, as the components in the original model were too separate in their functioning. The original model didn't explain how long-term memory could influence immediate recall. It was therefore considered that there must be some interactivity between them. How can we recall 12 and more words if the phonological loop has less capacity? Baddeley and Wilson proposed that an episodic buffer acts as an intermediary between the phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad, that in brackets it has cross-modal information. This is a process of active binding, or sticking things together. Evidence of the episodic buffer. Cincotta and others tested participants with a memory span for Arabic numerals and digit words. Participants combined information from both the phonological loop and visuospatial sketchpad. Zhang's participants recalled a mixture of digits and visual locations in an fMRI setting. These participants yielded greater right prefrontal activation than in an unmixed control condition. That is, a mixing effect was found, location and digit. Baddeley and Wilson found that good immediate prose recall was dependent on the capacity of the episodic buffer and an efficiently functioning central executive, which creates and maintains information in the buffer. Thus, even amnesiacs, long-term memory deficit people, were able to have good prose recall, provided that their executive functioning was intact. Other evidence cast doubt on the importance of central executive in prose recall with a failure to replicate. And there's another video of Alan Baddeley called Introduction of the Episodic Buffer. Next, the visuospatial sketchpad. The visuospatial sketchpad is used in the temporary storage and manipulation of spatial and visual information. Logie proposed that it consists of the visual cache, which stores information about visual form and colour. Logie moreover proposed that the inner scribe, which processes spatial and movement information, is involved in the rehearsal of information in the visual cache. The inner scribe then transfers information from the visual cache to the central executive. The visuospatial sketchpad evaluated. So the strengths of the sketchpad, they are supported by research that shows the independence in spatial and visual tasks. There's support from studies of brain-damaged patients. And the weaknesses of the visuospatial sketchpad, many tasks require both components, and it is not yet clear how information is combined and integrated. Oh gosh, and of course there's another short video, Alan Baddeley, Rehearsal in the Visuospatial Sketchpad. Then we have the central executive, which is seen as an attention system with four main processes. These processes are 1. Switching of retrieval plans, 2. Time sharing in dual task studies, 3. Selective attention to certain stimuli while ignoring others, and 4. Temporary activation of long-term memory. For an overview of the origins of the central executive from Baddeley, watch the video Alan Baddeley, The Origins of the Central Executive. Executive functions. Eysenck and others, not sure how to pronounce that, found cognitive tasks involve multiple processes by using latent variable analysis, LVA, on healthy participants' performance. LVA revealed 3 partially independent functions. Collette and others further found that these 3 functions activated distinct prefrontal regions, with all tested tasks yielded activation in the following: right intraparietal sulcus, selective attention to relevant stimuli and suppression of irrelevant information; left superior parietal sulcus, switching and integration processes; left lateral prefrontal cortex, monitoring and temporal organisation. It also showed that coordinating tasks, i.e. dual tasking, is another executive function with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activations. I'm starting to feel like I'm doing a med degree. Dysexecutive syndrome. Baddeley identified dysexecutive syndrome to include impairments in planning, organising, monitoring behaviour and initiating behaviour. In the syndrome, there is often damage to the frontal lobes, with some patients additionally having damage to posterior, mainly parietal regions. The behavioural assessment of the dysexecutive syndrome, BADS, by Wilson and others, addresses rule shifting, generating and implementing solutions to practical problems and dividing time efficiently. Stuss and Alexander further refined the syndrome and found that patients with widespread frontal damage had a global dysexecutive syndrome. They also found that there were actually 3 executive processes within the frontal lobes. These differed from Eysenck and others' functions, as patients with selective lesions exhibited problems with a single process. The central executive evaluated. The strengths are There is accumulating evidence that inhibition, updating, shifting, and dual task coordination may be the 4 major executive processes. Okay, and the weaknesses are the notion of a single dysexecutive syndrome is misleading. There are various processes associated with different frontal regions are involved. Executive processes associated with healthy individuals don't match up exactly to those determined via patient studies. And now on to the reading for working memory. Is short-term memory useful in everyday life? As textbook writers sometimes point out, it allows us to remember a telephone number for the few seconds required to dial it. However, that's now irrelevant because most people have mobile or cell phones that store all the phone numbers needed regularly. Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch provided a convincing answer to that question. They argued that we typically use short-term memory when performing complex tasks. With such tasks, you carry out various processes. However, you also have to store briefly information about the outcome of early processes in short-term memory as you move on to later ones. For example, this happens very often in mental arithmetic. One of Baddeley and Hitch's central insights was that the short-term memory is essential in the performance of numerous tasks that are not explicitly memory tasks. The above line of thinking led Baddeley and Hitch to replace the concept of the short-term store with that of working memory. Since then, the conceptualization of the working memory system has become increasingly complex. The latest version of the working memory model has 4 components. A modality-free central executive, which is an attentional system. The phonological loop, processing and storing information briefly in a phonological, or in brackets, speech-based form. A visuospatial sketchpad, specialised for spatial and visual processing and temporary storage. And an episodic buffer providing temporary storage for integrated information coming from the visuospatial sketchpad and phonological loop. This component, added 25 years after the others, is discussed later. The most important component is the central executive. It has limited capacity, resembles attention, and deals with any cognitively demanding task. The phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad are slave systems used by the central executive for specific purposes. The phonological loop preserves the order in which words are presented, whereas the visuospatial sketchpad stores and manipulates spatial and visual information. All 3 components discussed above have limited capacity and can function fairly independently of the others. 2 key assumptions follow. If 2 tasks use the same component, they cannot be performed successfully together. And if 2 tasks use different components, it should be possible to perform them as well together as separately. Numerous dual task studies have been carried out on the basis of these assumptions. For example, Robbins and others considered the selection of chess moves by weaker and stronger players. The player selected continuation moves from varying chess positions while also performing one of the following tasks. 1. Repetitive tapping, the control condition, and 2. Random number generation. This involves the central executive. I'm just going to read these key terms again. So the central executive is a modality-free, limited capacity component of working memory. The phonological loop is a component of working memory in which speech-based information is processed and stored and subvocal articulation occurs. Visuospatial sketchpad is a component of working memory used to process visual and spatial information and to store this information briefly. And the episodic buffer is a component of working memory. It is essentially passive and stores integrated information briefly. I just cannot get a flow happening with all these big words. Then we have articulatory suppression, which is a rapid repetition of a simple sound. Example, the, which uses the articulatory control process of the phonological loop. Robbins and others found that selecting chess moves involves the central executive and the visuospatial sketchpad, but not the phonological loop. The additional tasks had similar effects on stronger and weaker players, suggesting both groups used the working memory system in the same way. Another key term, the phonological similarity effect, is the finding that Immediate serial recall of verbal material is reduced when items sound similar. According to the working memory model, the phonological loop consists of two components: a passive phonological store directly concerned with speech perception, and an articulatory process linked to speech production, i.e. rehearsal, giving access to the phonological store. Suppose we test people's memory span by representing visually a series of words and requiring immediate recall in the correct order. Would they use the phonological loop to engage in verbal rehearsal, i.e. saying the words over and over to themselves on this task? Two kinds of supporting evidence are discussed below. First, there is the phonological similarity effect, which was the key term I said earlier, which is reduced immediate serial recall when words are phonologically similar, having similar sounds. For example, fee, he, ni, li, me, and she form a list of phonologically similar words, whereas bay, ho, it, odd, shy, and up form a list of phonologically dissimilar words. The ability to recall the words in order was 25% worse with the phonologically similar list. Research has revealed that the processes underlying the phonological similarity effect are more complex than originally assumed. Eysenck found the effect does not only involve the phonological loop, semantic processes also play a part. Schwepp and others pointed out that the working memory model is underspecified. The emphasis in research has been on similarity at the phonemic level. Phonemes are the basic units of sound. However, it is not clear whether the phonological similarity effect depends more on acoustic similarity, similar sounds, or on articulatory similarity, similar articulatory movements. Schwepp addresses the above issue. The phonological similarity effect depends more on acoustic than articulatory similarity. However, there was a significant effect of articulatory similarity when recall was spoken, but not when it was written. These complexities are not predicted by the working memory model. Second, there is the word length effect, which is the finding that verbal memory span decreases when longer words are presented. So, word span, number of words recalled immediately in the correct order, is greater for short than long words. There is much evidence for this effect. Baddeley obtained the effect with visually and with auditorily presented words. In other conditions, participants engaged in articulatory suppression, repeating the digits 1 to 8, to prevent rehearsal within the phonological loop while being presented with word lists. This eliminated the word length effect with visually presented words, suggesting the effect depends on rehearsal. This conclusion was supported by Jacquemont. They studied the word span in a brain-damaged patient with greatly impaired ability to engage in verbal rehearsal. Theoretically, this should have prevented her from having a word length effect. That was indeed what Jacquemont found. Jalbert and others argued that there is important confounding between word length and orthographic neighbourhood. A word's orthographic neighbourhood consists of words of the same length differing from it in only one letter. Short words generally have more neighbours than long ones, and so the so-called word length effect may be due more to the neighbourhood size than to the word length itself. When short, 1 syllable, and long, 3 syllable words were equated for neighbourhood size, the word length effect disappeared. Thus, there are some doubts about the existence of the word length effect. What use is the phonological loop in everyday life? After all, we do not often try to remember lists of unrelated words in the correct order. We can address this issue by studying brain-damaged patients with a very impaired phonological loop. This was done by Baddeley and others. They tested a patient, PV, who had a digit span of only 2 items, much less than the population average of about 7. PV coped very well with everyday life, including running a shop and raising a family. Baddeley argued that the phonological loop is useful when learning a language. PV, a native Italian speaker, performed as well as healthy participants when learning to associate pairs of unrelated words in Italian. However, her performance was dramatically inferior to that of healthy controls when learning to associate Russian words with their Italian translations. Indeed, she showed no learning at all over 10 trials. In similar fashion, Papagno and others found that articulatory suppression, which reduces use of the phonological loop, greatly slowed the learning of foreign vocabulary. However, it had little effect on the learning of Italian words. You probably have experience of using your inner voice to resist temptation. This suggests the phonological loop can be used for action control. Tullett used two versions of a simple task varying in their demands on action control. In one condition, use of the phonological loop on the task was reduced by articulatory suppression, saying the word computer repeatedly. As predicted, articulatory suppression reduced action control and increased the error rate considerably only when the demands on action control were high. Visuospatial sketchpad. The visuospatial sketchpad is used for the temporary storage and manipulation of visual patterns and spatial movement. In essence, visual processing involves remembering what, and spatial processing involves remembering where. The visuospatial sketchpad is very useful in everyday life. We use it to find the route when moving from one place to another or when watching television. The most important issue, whether there is a single system combining visual and spatial processing or whether there are partially or completely separate visual and spatial systems. According to Logie, the visuospatial sketchpad consists of two components. The visual cache, this stores information about visual form and colour, and the inner scribe. This processes spatial and movement information. It is involved in the rehearsal of information in the visual cache and transfers information from the visual cache to the central executive. So the key terms are visual cache, stores information about visual form and colour, and the inner scribe deals with spatial and movement information. The findings. Evidence supporting the notion of separate visual and spatial systems was reported by Smith and Jones. Two visual stimuli were presented together, followed by a probe stimulus. Participants decided whether the probe was in the same location as one of the initial stimuli, spatial task, or had the same form, visual task. Even though the stimuli were identical in the two tasks, there were clear differences in patterns of brain activation. There was more activity in the right hemisphere during the spatial task than the visual task, but more activity in the left hemisphere during the visual task than the spatial task. Zimmer reviewed research on the brain areas involved in visual and spatial processing. Areas within the occipital and temporal lobes were activated during visual processing. In contrast, areas within the parietal cortex, especially the intraparietal sulcus, were activated during the spatial processing. Clow and Zhao also explored the issue of whether they are separate visual and spatial systems. They used two main tasks. One was spatial task, memory for dot locations, and the other was a visual task, memory for Chinese characters. Sometimes the main task was performed with a colour discrimination task to provide visual interference. At other times, the main task was performed with a movement discrimination task to provide spatial interference. What would we predict if there are separate spatial and visual components? First, the spatial interference task should disrupt performance more on the spatial main task than the visual main task. Second, the visual interference task should disrupt performance more on the visual main task than the spatial main task. Both predictions were supported. In spite of the differences between visual and spatial processing, both can require the attentional resources of the central executive. Vergaway and others argued that the tasks used by Clower and Zhao were too simple and require much attention. Accordingly, Vergau used more demanding versions of Clower and Zhao's tasks. Their findings were very different from those of Clower and Zhao in that each type of interference had comparable effects on the spatial and visual main tasks. So what can we conclude? There are general, attentionally based interference effects when tasks are demanding, but interference effects are specific to the type of interference when tasks are relatively undemanding. The take-home message is that the apparent separateness of the visual and spatial components of the visuospatial sketchpad depends on the extent to which general attention processes are required. Evaluation. Most research indicates that the visuospatial sketchpad consists of somewhat separable visual and spatial components. However, it remains for the future to understand more fully how processing and information from the two components are combined and integrated. In addition, much remains unknown about interactions between the workings of the visuospatial sketchpad and the episodic buffer. Finally, as Badley admitted, we know little about rehearsal processes within the visuospatial sketchpad. The central executive. So there's a key term here, executive processes. Processes that organise and coordinate the functioning of the cognitive system to achieve current goals. The central executive, which resembles an attentional system, is the most important and versatile component of working memory. It is heavily involved in almost all complex cognitive activities, example, solving a problem, carrying out 2 tasks at the same time, but does not store information. It's generally assumed the prefrontal cortex is the brain region most involved in the central executive functions. Modeghi reviewed studies using repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation, or RTMS, to disrupt the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, BA9/46. Performance on many complex tasks was impaired by this manipulation, indicating this region is involved in several central executive functions. However, executive processes do not depend solely on the prefrontal cortex. Many patients with illnesses or injuries such as diffuse trauma, multiple sclerosis, and vascular cognitive impairment have poor executive functioning with little or no frontal damage. Baddeley has always recognised that the central executive is associated with several executive processes that organise and coordinate the functioning of the cognitive system to achieve current goals. Baddeley speculatively identified 4 such processes. 1. Focusing attention or concentration. 2. Dividing attention between 2 stimulus streams. 3. Switching attention between tasks. And 4. Interfacing with long-term memory. In fact, it has proved very difficult to obtain consensus on the number and nature of executive processes. One of the most influential theoretical approaches is discussed, but note that several different approaches have been proposed. Eysenck and others executive functions, Miyake. So many different pronunciations of that. Okay, a crucial issue is to identify the number and nature of these executive processes. The approach advocated by Eysenck and others has been especially influential. They administered several executive tasks to their participants. Then they focused on positive correlations among tasks as the basis for identifying tasks all involving the same executive process. Eysenck identified 3 related but separable executive processes or functions. 1. Inhibition function. Used to deliberately override dominant responses and to resist distraction. For example, it is used on the Stroop task, which involves naming the colours in which words are printed. When the words are conflicting colour words, example, the word blue printed in red, it is necessary to inhibit saying the word instead of naming the colour. 2. Shifting function. Used to switch flexibly between tasks or mental sets. Suppose you are presented with 2 numbers on each trial. Your task is to switch between multiplying the 2 numbers and dividing one by the other on alternate trials. Such task switching requires the shifting function. 3. Updating function. Used to monitor and engage in rapid addition or deletion of working memory contents. For example, this function is used if you must keep track of the most recent member of each of several categories. I think everyone's seen the Stroop task or tried the Stroop task. If not, YouTuber STROOP. So Eysenck, Miyake, Mr. Miyagi, and Friedman developed their theory into the unity diversity framework. The basic idea is that each executive function consists of what is common to all 3 executive functions plus what is unique to that function. Friedman and others tested this framework. After accounting for what was common to all functions, there was no unique variance left for the inhibition function. In other words, the inhibition function correlates almost perfectly with the common executive function. What exactly is common to all executive functions? According to Miyagi, that's what I'm going to call that person from now on, it is one's ability to actively maintain task goals and goal-orientated information and use this information to effectively bias lower-level processing. Friedman obtained additional support for the unity/diversity framework. They studied monozygotic, identical, and dizygotic fraternal twins. The key finding was that genetic factors contributed substantially to individual differences at both unity and diversity levels. Neuroimaging studies in which brain areas associated with each executive process or function are identified have provided some support for the unity diversity framework. Collette and others found all three of Miyagi's functions were associated with activation in a different prefrontal area. This is consistent with the diversity notion. In addition, all tasks produced activated in other areas, example the left lateral prefrontal cortex, which is consistent with the unity notion. Haddon and Gabrielli carried out a similar study focusing on the inhibition and shifting functions. First, several areas, example dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and the basal ganglia, were fairly strongly associated with both functions. Second, other areas, example the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, bilateral temporoparietal junction, were more activated by inhibition than shifting. Third, there was only modest evidence of brain areas more activated by shifting than inhibition. In sum, there was considerable overlap in the brain areas associated with inhibition and shifting. However, there was also evidence of diversity, especially with respect to the inhibition function. Dissociative syndrome. I could be saying that wrong too. Dice executive syndrome. I'm going with dysexecutive syndrome. That's a key term, and it's a condition in which damage to the frontal lobes cause impairments to the central executive component of working memory. Another approach to understanding the functions of the central executive is to study brain-damaged individuals whose central executive functioning is impaired. Such individuals... my own mistakes drive me insane. I don't even know what happens to my mouth half the time. Such individuals suffer from dysexecutive syndrome. This syndrome involves numerous cognitive problems. Godefroy and others identified impaired response inhibition, rule deduction and generation, maintenance and shifting of sets, and information generation as symptoms of dysexecutive syndrome. Unsurprisingly, patients with this syndrome typically have great problems in holding a job and functioning adequately in everyday life. Stuss and Alexander argued that the notion of a dysexecutive syndrome is flawed because it implies brain damage to the frontal lobes damages all central executive functions. They accepted that patients with widespread damage to the frontal lobes have a global dysexecutive syndrome. In their own research, however, they focused on patients with limited damage within prefrontal cortex and identified 3 executive processes. 1. Task setting. This involves planning. It is the ability to set a stimulus-response relationship, necessary in the early stages of learning to drive a car or planning a wedding. 2. Monitoring. This involves checking the adequacy of one's task performance. Deficient monitoring leads to increased variability of performance and increased errors. 3. Energization. This involves sustained attention or concentration. Deficient energization leads to slow performance on all tasks requiring fast responding. Each of the above processes was associated with a different region within the frontal cortex. While Stuss and Alexander's 3 processes are rather different from the previously identified by Mr. Miyagi's, there is reasonable overlap. For example, task setting and monitoring both involve aspects of cognitive control, as do the processes of inhibition and shifting. The importance of the 3 executive processes identified by Stuss and Alexander was confirmed by Stuss. In addition, he argued for the existence of another executive process he called the metacognition/integration, or metacognition/integration, however you like to say it. According to Stuss, this function is integrative and coordinating orchestrating. It includes recognizing the differences between what one knows and what one believes. Evidence for this process has come from research on patients with damage to BA10, frontopolar prefrontal cortex. Glacier and others administered many tasks, including some designed to assess inhibition and shifting, in brain-damaged patients. One was the Iowa gambling task, which assesses value-based decision-making. It involves 4 virtual decks of cards from which the participants choose cards and win or lose money as a result. Most participants gradually learn there are good decks, that generally lead to winning money and bad decks that lead to losing money. Glacier and others' key finding was the identification of two separate brain networks. 1. A cognitive control network, including the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, associated with response inhibition, conflict monitoring and switching. And 2. A value-based decision-making network, including the orbitofrontal, ventromedial and frontopolar cortex. This network has strong connections to the limbic system, which is involved in emotion and value judgments. Evaluation. The central executive consists of various related but separable executive processes such as inhibition and shifting as proposed within the unity/diversity framework. This conclusion is based on both behavioural and neuroimaging evidence. The notion of a dysexecutive syndrome is misleading because it implies a single pattern of impairment. Instead, there are various executive processes associated with different parts of the prefrontal cortex. What are the limitations of theory and research on the central executive? First, Mr. Miyagi pointed out, research in this area is difficult because of the task impurity problem. Most tasks require several different processes, making it hard to identify the contribution made by any specific executive process. Second, the number and nature of executive processes remain unclear. For example, should dual task coordination, value-based decision-making and metacognition/integration be regarded as executive processes? Oh, and we're done. That is everything on week 5, memory basics. And I don't think I've learnt a thing. There is no way I'm going to remember any of those things in the last reading that I did. The first one's not so bad though. Good luck.